Every American alive today carries a quiet anxiety that refuses to name itself. You feel it when the rent comes due, when the grocery bill climbs higher each month, when your neighbor's house sits empty after foreclosure, when your children wonder if college is even worth the debt anymore. This restlessness is not paranoia, it is pattern recognition. It is the body sensing what the mind hesitates to acknowledge, that the economic ground beneath the American middle class is crumbling in a sequence we have seen before. Not once but 6 times across history, in empires that believed themselves eternal until the moment they were not. Those who study the fall of civilizations do not speak in metaphors, they speak in currency, debasement percentages, in wealth inequality ratios, in the documented collapse of public services and housing stability. They speak in the language of Rome, Byzantium, the Ottomans, the British, the Soviets, and others who followed an identical trajectory from prosperity to extraction to extinction. The pattern is so consistent that to ignore it is not optimism but willful blindness. What follows is not speculation, it is documentation. Before we proceed, I need you to stay with this account all the way to the closing words, because the implications of what you are about to encounter require the full historical context to grasp completely. The middle-class extinction pattern does not announce itself with sirens. It unfolds across decades, in legislative sessions and central bank meetings, in loan offices and factory closures, until one day a society wakes to find that the stability took for granted has become a memory its grandparents speak of with confused nostalgia. When you reach the end of this examination, I want you to leave a comment telling me where you are watching from, your city and your country, because the forces we are discussing respect no borders, and I need to understand how widely this awareness has spread. Now let us begin with what the middle class actually was, and why its destruction has preceded every major imperial collapse in recorded history. The American middle class rose from specific historical conditions that emerged after the Second World War. The GI Bill sent 8 million veterans to college and subsidized home purchases for millions more. Union membership peaked at nearly 35% of the workforce in the 1950s. Manufacturing jobs paid enough to support families on single incomes. Home ownership expanded from 44% in 1940 to 64% by 1980. The middle class was not an accident. It was engineered through policy, progressive taxation, strong labor protections, infrastructure investment, accessible education, and a currency backed by productive capacity rather than speculative finance. This middle stratum created political stability because citizens had something to protect and a system they believed served them. The American dream was not merely propaganda. For 3 decades it was measurable reality. Families accumulated equity. Children exceeded their parents' education and income. Social mobility was not a talking point but a statistical fact. The middle class provided tax revenue, consumer demand, military personnel, civic participation, and cultural cohesion. It was the load-bearing wall of the entire structure. And here is what history teaches us. Every empire that has dismantled its middle class through currency, debasement, debt accumulation, inequality, and austerity has followed that act with terminal decline. Rome offers the clearest case study because its documentation survived. The Roman Empire in the 2nd century maintained a broad middle class of merchants, artisans, small landholders, and soldiers whose pay allowed modest prosperity. The denarius, Rome's silver currency, held roughly 95% silver content under Augustus. But imperial overreach required ever larger military expenditures to defend indefensible borders. As costs outpaced revenues, emperors began debasing the currency. Septimius Severus reduced the denarius to 50 to 60% silver by the early 3rd century. By the reign of Gallienus in the 260s, the denarius contained less than 5% silver. This was not hidden policy. Citizens could feel the coins growing lighter, see them tarnish faster, watch prices double and triple as merchants adjusted for worthless metal. The Cato Institute's historical research documents that excessive government spending and currency debasement created runaway inflation that destroyed the purchasing power of Roman wages. Soldiers demanded payment in gold instead of debased silver. The government responded by raising taxes, but the middle class could not pay. Small landholders sold their property to wealthy elites and became tenant farmers. The broad base of taxpayers collapsed into a narrow aristocracy and a vast population of dependents. Public services deteriorated. Roads went unrepaired. Aqueducts cracked. The grain dole became unreliable. By the 4th century, the Roman middle class had effectively ceased to exist, replaced by a tutor society of latifundia plantation owners and bound peasants. The Western Roman Empire did not fall to barbarians so much as it deflated into irrelevance, hollowed out economically decades before the political apparatus collapsed in 476 AD. The Byzantine Empire repeated the pattern with minor variations. After Justinian's reconquest campaigns in the 6th century drained the treasury, successive emperors raised taxes and debased the gold solidus, previously the most stable currency in the Mediterranean world. The middle class of free peasant soldiers, the backbone of Byzantine military and tax systems, gradually lost their land to aristocratic estates. By the 11th century, the theme system that had sustained a citizen soldier class had collapsed. Byzantium increasingly relied on expensive foreign mercenaries while its tax base shrank. The empire survived until 1453, not because it remained strong but because its rivals were temporarily weaker. The Ottoman Empire that conquered Constantinople then proceeded to follow the same arc. Ottoman stability in the 15th and 16th centuries rested on the timur system, which granted land revenues to cavalry soldiers in exchange for military service, creating a rural middle class of Sipahis. But as the empire expanded and centralized, the government converted timurs into tax farms sold to the highest bidder. Wealthy elites bought the rights to tax entire provinces and extracted maximum revenue with no incentive to maintain productivity. The Sipahi class dissolved. Peasants fled overtaxed land. By the 18th century, the Ottoman economy was stagnant, its military obsolete, its middle class a memory. The empire became the sick man of Europe long before it formally dissolved after World War I. The British Empire presents a particularly instructive case for Americans because Britain pioneered industrial capitalism and global finance before experiencing a middle-class collapse tied directly to imperial contraction. Britain's middle class expanded dramatically during the 19th century as industrialization created new wealth. But the empire's economic model was extractive. Colonial holdings provided raw materials and captive markets. When Britain lost India in 1947 and African colonies in the 1960s, the flow of expropriated wealth stopped. Research published in The Conversation demonstrates that Britain's income inequality was among the lowest in Europe in the 1970s but became the highest of all 28 European Union member states by 2015. The loss of empire forced British elites to extract wealth domestically instead of colonially. Wages stagnated. Shareholder profits rose. Public services were gutted under austerity policies introduced in 2010. Food banks proliferated. Infant mortality increased for the first time in generations in 2015, 2016, and 2017. Homelessness tripled in many cities between 2010 and 2018. The British middle class, which had depended on imperial plunder redistributed through welfare state mechanisms, discovered that when the plunder stopped, the redistribution stopped, and they were left competing with oligarchs for scraps. Brexit itself emerged from this crisis, a populist reaction to economic decline that the establishment had no plan to address. The Soviet Union collapsed for many reasons, but the extinction of its middle class was both cause and effect. Soviet central planning created a vast population of engineers, teachers, doctors, and technical workers who enjoyed modest but stable lives with guaranteed housing, healthcare, education, and employment. But the system's inefficiencies compounded. Military spending consumed an estimated 15 to 20% of GDP throughout the 1980s. Productivity stagnated. Consumer goods shortages became endemic when the political structure collapsed in 1991. Government infrastructure evaporated almost overnight. Payroll systems disappeared. Pensions became worthless as hyperinflation destroyed the ruble. State assets were seized by mafia networks and oligarchs who had been positioned within the system. The middle class was wiped out within a decade. Engineers drove taxis. Doctors sold goods at kiosks. The professional class lost savings, social standing, and faith in governance. Russia's demographic crisis and current authoritarian trajectory traced directly to this middle-class extinction event. A population that loses stability once becomes profoundly risk-averse and seeks strongman leadership over democratic uncertainty. Now consider the United States in the present moment. Federal debt exceeds $34 trillion, more than 125% of GDP. The dollar's purchasing power has eroded by over 95% since the Federal Reserve's creation in 1913, with acceleration since the abandonment of the gold standard in 1971. Real wages adjusted for inflation have stagnated since the 1970s. Even as productivity increased, the wealthiest 1% of Americans now control more wealth than the entire middle 60%. Housing costs have outpaced wage growth by such margins that homeownership, once the foundation of middle-class wealth accumulation, is increasingly unattainable for younger generations. Student debt exceeds $1.7 trillion. Medical bankruptcy remains the leading cause of personal financial collapse. Homelessness has increased dramatically in major cities. Infrastructure receives a C- grade from the American Society of Civil Engineers. Public education is funded through property taxes, creating vast inequalities between wealthy and poor districts. Political polarization has reached levels not seen since the Civil War, with mutual distrust between parties and regions approaching societal fracture. These are not random developments. They are the middle-class extinction pattern in progress. The mechanism is consistent across every case. Governments overspend on military expansion or welfare commitments they cannot sustain. They debase currency through inflation rather than raise taxes on elites. The middle class, whose savings are denominated in that currency, loses purchasing power. Wages stagnate while asset prices controlled by the wealthy inflate. Housing becomes unaffordable. Public services deteriorate as tax revenues decline. The middle class either sinks into precarity or engages in debt-fueled consumption to maintain appearances. Elites accumulate land, capital, and political power. The social contract fractures. Institutions lose legitimacy. The society becomes unstable, unable to defend itself militarily or maintain internal order. At that point, external shocks, whether barbarian invasions, military defeats, or financial crises, deliver the final blow to a structure already hollowed from within. The fall is not the cause, the fall is the conclusion. What distinguishes the American situation is the speed of the pattern's acceleration and the global integration of the financial system. Rome debased its currency over 2 centuries. The dollar has lost 95% of its value in just over a century, with the pace quickening. British imperial decline took 6 decades from Indian independence to Brexit chaos. America's middle-class collapse has been underway for 50 years, but intensifying. Soviet disintegration was sudden but geographically contained. American financial instability would cascade globally because the dollar remains a world reserve currency and American markets dominate global capital flows. The implications are not merely national, they are civilizational. And yet the pattern suggests that collapse is not inevitable if the underlying mechanisms are reversed. Restore currency stability, reduce inequality, rebuild public goods, re-establish social trust. History shows that societies which recognize the pattern early can arrest it. Those which deny it until the structure fails cannot. The parallel between historical empires and contemporary America becomes impossible to dismiss when you examine not general impressions, but specific data points that track the dissolution of economic stability for ordinary households. The Pew Research Center documented in 2024 that the middle class now constitutes just 51% of American households, down from 61% in 1971. More revealing than the shrinkage is the income trajectory. The median income of upper-income households grew to be 7.3 times that of lower-income households by 2022, up from 6.3 in 1970. The middle-class share of overall household income fell to 43% by 2022, less than their share of the population. This is not natural market evolution, this is extraction. The Economic Policy Institute's wage analysis spanning 1979 to 2013 shows that middle-wage workers experienced only 6% hourly wage growth over 34 years, less than 0.2% annually, while high-wage workers saw 41% increases. Low-wage workers lost 5% of their purchasing power entirely. Every cent of productivity gain over 3 decades flowed upward. The Federal Reserve data from the first quarter of 2024 indicates that the top 1% of American households held 30.5% of all wealth while the bottom 50% held 2.5%. Between 1989 and 2022, the wealth of the top 1% increased by $35 trillion, a 309% gain, while the bottom 50% gained only $2 trillion, a 111% increase from a vastly smaller base. These are not the numbers of a functioning republic. These are the numbers of a resource extraction operation. Housing provides the clearest illustration of middle-class extinction because home ownership historically represented the primary wealth-building mechanism for American families. When housing becomes unaffordable, generational wealth transfer stops, and the middle class cannot reproduce itself. The Department of Housing and Urban Development reported in December 2024 that over 770,000 Americans were homeless during the January 2024 count, an 18% increase from the prior year and the highest figure since federal tracking began in 2007. The increase was driven by housing costs that have outpaced wage growth consistently since the 1980s. Rent consumes 40 to 50% of income for lower-income households in most urban markets. Home prices in major metropolitan areas require income levels far exceeding median wages. The median home price in the United States reached approximately $420,000 by late 2024, while median household income hovered near $75,000, creating a ratio that makes home ownership mathematically impossible without substantial down payments that most households cannot accumulate while paying rent. Younger generations face student loan debt averaging $30,000 to $40,000, further delaying or preventing home purchase. The result is a permanent renter class with no equity accumulation, no wealth to pass to children, no stake in long-term community stability. This is the Roman insulae pattern repeating. Roman middle-class families who lost their land became urban renters in multi-story apartment blocks owned by aristocrats. They paid rent until they died. Their children paid rent until they died. Wealth concentrated. The social structure calcified. America is replicating this process at digital speed. The currency debasement mechanism operates differently in a fiat monetary system than in a commodity currency like the Roman denarius, but the effect is identical. The state expands the money supply to finance expenditures it cannot fund through taxation. and the resulting inflation destroys the purchasing power of wage earners, while asset holders benefit from price appreciation. The United States abandoned the gold standard in 1971, removing the final constraint on monetary expansion. Since that decision, the money supply has grown exponentially while wages stagnated. The Federal Reserve balance sheet, which stood at around $900 billion in 2008, expanded to over $8 trillion by 2022 through quantitative easing programs that purchased government and mortgage-backed securities. This injected trillions into financial markets, inflating stock and real estate prices far beyond the reach of wage-dependent households. The S&P 500 increased roughly sixfold between 2009 and 2024, enriching the 10% of Americans who own 89% of all stocks. Meanwhile, the Consumer Price Index shows cumulative inflation of approximately 35% from 2000 to 2024, but housing, healthcare, and education costs increased by multiples of that figure. Groceries that cost $100 in 2000 required $200 by 2024. Wages did not double. The mechanism is Roman currency debasement translated into modern central banking. The state creates money to sustain itself. Asset holders convert that money into appreciating property and equities. Wage earners watch their savings and income lose value. The middle class is debased into poverty. Before we continue deeper into the implications of this trajectory, I need to ask you to take one moment to engage with this work. If this historical analysis is clarifying patterns you have sensed but not fully articulated, press the like button on this video. Subscribe to this channel and activate the notification bell so you receive future examinations of these critical issues. And leave a comment telling me where you are watching from, your city and your country. Because understanding the geographic spread of this awareness helps me tailor future content to the concerns of people experiencing these pressures in real time. Now let us turn to what comes next when a middle class collapses completely. The Soviet collapse offers the most instructive modern parallel because it happened within living memory and its effects are thoroughly documented. When the USSR dissolved in 1991, the nominal middle class of engineers, teachers, doctors, scientists, and administrators lost everything within 2 years. Savings became worthless as hyperinflation reached 2,500% in 1992. State employment guarantees evaporated. The social safety net that had provided healthcare, housing, and pensions disintegrated. Oligarchs with connections to power structures seized state assets in rigged privatization schemes. By 1995, 7 men controlled 50% of Russia's economy. Life expectancy for Russian men fell from 64 years in 1989 to 57 years by 1994. A demographic collapse unprecedented in peacetime. Birth rates plummeted. Alcoholism, suicide, and cardiovascular disease spiked. The professional middle class that had sustained Soviet technological and scientific achievement was destroyed in less than a decade. Many emigrated, others descended into subsistence. The societal trust necessary for democratic governance evaporated. And Russia embraced authoritarian stability under Vladimir Putin because a population that has lost everything once will trade freedom for security. This is the pattern. A middle-class extinction event produces either authoritarian reaction or societal fragmentation, sometimes both. The United States is not immune to this trajectory simply because it occurred elsewhere. The mechanisms are identical. The timeline is compressed. American political polarization reflects the early stages of this social fracture. When the middle class prospers, citizens share common interests, functional schools, safe neighborhoods, reliable infrastructure, economic opportunity. When the middle class disintegrates, society splits into mutually hostile factions, competing for diminishing resources. Trust in institutions collapses. Pew Research Center. Polling shows that trust in the federal government fell from 73% in 1958 to just 16% by 2023. Trust in media, academia, and corporate institutions followed similar declines. Political parties no longer debate policy within a shared framework of national interest. They engage in zero-sum warfare where the opposing side represents existential threat. This is not a failure of civility. This is the predictable result of economic desperation. When families cannot afford housing, healthcare, or education despite working full-time, they do not blame impersonal economic forces. They blame whoever the media or politicians identify as responsible. Immigrants, corporations, government bureaucrats, coastal elites, rural reactionaries. The specifics vary. The dynamic is consistent. A collapsing middle class seeks scapegoats, and demagogues supply them. Rome experienced this as optimates and populares factions waged literal civil wars. Byzantium faced it as theological disputes became pretexts for class conflict. The Ottomans saw it in Janissary revolts and provincial uprisings. Britain exported it to colonies and then suffered Brexit-fueled division. The Soviets endured nationalist breakaway movements and violent suppression. America is not exceptional, America is typical. Public services deteriorate predictably as tax revenues decline and political will evaporates. The American Society of Civil Engineers gave American infrastructure a C- grade in 2021, estimating a $2.6 trillion funding gap over 10 years. Roads, bridges, water systems, electrical grids, and public transit require investment that neither federal nor state governments can fund without raising taxes on wealthy individuals and corporations, which political dynamics make nearly impossible. Public education funding increasingly relies on local property taxes, creating vast inequalities between wealthy suburbs and poor urban or rural districts. Teacher shortages, school closures, and declining literacy rates follow. The healthcare system, already the most expensive and least efficient in the developed world, prices out millions who delay treatment until conditions become emergencies, then default on bills, driving hospitals into financial crisis. Emergency rooms in major cities experience overcrowding and staff shortages. Rural hospitals close entirely, creating medical deserts across vast regions. These are not random failures. These are the predictable results of a society that can no longer fund collective goods because wealth is concentrated in private hands that resist taxation. Rome's aqueducts cracked and went unrepaired. American water systems now deliver lead and carcinogens. The parallel is not metaphorical. It is structural. The survivalist response to middle-class extinction emerges organically from these conditions because, when institutional reliability collapses, individuals and communities must provide for themselves or perish. This is not paranoia. This is historical pattern recognition. Americans who study the Soviet collapse, the Weimar hyperinflation, the Argentine economic crisis, or the Lebanese financial implosion understand that modern societies can disintegrate rapidly. Supply chains depend on functional currency and credit systems. When those fail, food and medicine become scarce. Venezuela had the largest oil reserves in the world and still experienced mass starvation. When its currency collapsed and government dysfunction reached critical levels, grocery stores in Caracas emptied within days. People lost 50 pounds in months. Crime became endemic. The educated middle class fled if they could. Those who remained adapted urban agriculture, barter networks, cross-border smuggling, expatriate remittances. Survival required skills that had been irrelevant for generations. Food preservation, water purification, home security, community defense, alternative currencies. American preppers who stockpile food, learn first aid, maintain firearms, and cultivate local networks are not irrational. They are applying historical lessons to present conditions. When public services fail, individuals must substitute private resilience. When currency becomes unreliable, tangible assets and skills replace money. When social trust evaporates, family and community networks become the only functional institutions. This is not a retreat from civilization. This is adaptation to civilization's retreat. Financial preparedness requires understanding that wealth stored in currency loses value during inflation and collapses entirely during hyperinflation, while wealth stored in productive assets, commodities, and skills retains utility. The middle-class strategy of saving dollars in bank accounts worked when currency was stable and interest rates exceeded inflation. That era has ended. Real interest rates, adjusted for inflation, have been negative or near zero for most of the past 15 years. Savings accounts lose purchasing power annually. The alternative is asset ownership, real estate if affordable, precious metals as inflation hedges, tools and equipment that produce value, education and skills that remain marketable during disruption. Debt is particularly dangerous during economic instability because income can vanish while debt obligations persist. Soviet professionals who held mortgages in 1989 found themselves unemployed by 1992 with no way to pay. Banks foreclosed. Families lost housing. The American household debt burden, including mortgages, student loans, auto loans, and credit cards, exceeds $17 trillion. A significant economic shock, mass unemployment, or sustained inflation could trigger cascading defaults that would devastate millions of families while enriching creditors and investors who buy distressed assets. The pattern repeats. The prepared endure. The unprepared suffer. Community resilience becomes decisive when centralized systems fail because humans are social creatures who cannot survive prolonged isolation or pure individual self-sufficiency. The most successful adaptations to societal collapse across history involve tight-knit communities that pooled resources, shared skills, and provided mutual defense. Argentine neighborhoods during the 2001 economic crisis organized barter clubs, communal kitchens, and local security patrols when government services evaporated. Greek communities during the 2010s debt crisis created alternative currencies, time banks, and cooperative farms when unemployment exceeded 25%. American communities that maintain church networks, volunteer fire departments, neighborhood associations, and local food systems possess infrastructure that can function when national or state systems fail. Urban areas face particular vulnerability because population density requires complex supply chains for food, water, and energy. Rural areas offer greater self-sufficiency potential but less access to medical care and specialized services. Suburban areas combine vulnerabilities of both with benefits of neither. The historical pattern suggests that mid-sized towns with local agriculture, manufacturing, and strong social cohesion fare best during collapse scenarios. Rome's provinces outlasted the Western Empire by centuries. Byzantine themes maintained order long after Constantinople fell. Ottoman villages endured while the imperial center decayed. American small towns and rural regions may prove more resilient than coastal megacities if national systems fracture, assuming they can overcome political divisions and resource scarcities. The ultimate question is whether the middle-class extinction pattern can be reversed or only endured. History offers limited examples of successful reversal and many examples of terminal decline followed by dark ages. Rome never recovered. Byzantium gradually weakened for 8 centuries. The Ottomans became a European puppet. Britain declined into a secondary power. The Soviet Union dissolved. But history also records societies that arrested decline through radical reform. Athens after the Peloponnesian War, China after the Warring States period, Japan after the Meiji Restoration, Germany after World War II. The common elements were recognition of crisis, political will to redistribute power and resources, and implementation of policies that rebuilt broad-based prosperity. The United States theoretically possesses the wealth, technology, and infrastructure to restore its middle class through progressive taxation, public investment, wage growth, housing construction, debt relief, and healthcare reform. The question is not economic feasibility but political possibility. The forces that benefit from wealth concentration wield enormous influence over policy. Reversing that requires either democratic mobilization on a scale not seen since the New Deal or a crisis so severe that elites fear systemic collapse more than they value their wealth. Neither seems imminent. The pattern therefore suggests that the extinction will continue until it reaches conclusion, and Americans must prepare accordingly. What you have witnessed across these 2 examinations is not speculation or political advocacy. It is documentation of a recurring historical pattern that has preceded every major imperial collapse in recorded history and is currently manifesting in the United States with increasing velocity. The middle class is not merely shrinking, it is being systematically dismantled through currency debasement, wage suppression, asset inflation, debt accumulation, and public service deterioration. The trajectory leads to either authoritarian consolidation, societal fragmentation, or both. Individual and community preparation, financial resilience, practical skills, and social networks offer the best chance of navigating what follows. The choice is not between optimism and pessimism, the choice is between awareness and ignorance. History rewards the former and buries the latter.